Hi, Dr. Z here, and you're listening to Psychonerds, the podcast that will shed clarity on the complicated world of psychoactive substances, popularly known as drugs. Homer Simpson has famously said that maybe life is just a bunch of stuff that happens. And that couldn't be more true. Life is just a bunch of stuff that happens. But what is happens? Happens is something that is recitable in a story. And a story is a neural configuration in the mind of a person that is relayed through sound waves from one person to another. But for that neural configuration to come into existence, you need neurons. And for neurons to come into existence in a way that they can relay stories, they have to be able to perceive stories. For that, signals from the environment like sound, touch, and light have to come onto receptors, become neurally transmitted information that has to be embedded in a certain pattern in a neural network, that holds the story before it's told to someone else. Now, what we are talking about is stories, because only stories are recitable, and they're only recitable between humans. Now, except for the handful of bonobos and gorillas that speak human sign language, basically stories are between people talking to people. And stories are stored in human brains. The overall collection of all stories is called knowledge. And so we have a process in which signals from the universe, whether they manifest themselves in energy or in matter, they have an effect through our sensory systems, which make their way as signals to our brain, which our brain turns into patterns, which it then very often forces into a story, which we then relay to each other. And if these stories are supported by evidence, then they're called science. And if they're not, they're called superstition or religion. So that's kind of what we want to talk about, and especially in the context of drugs. Drugs are to information coming to the brain what the equalizer is to audio coming into an audio system. Drugs are the set of levers and filters that are going to slightly tweak, downplay, upregulate, downsize, smooth out, accentuate, etc., the different parts of reality that are streaming into us from our touch sensors, our ears, our eyes, our mouth, our memories. All of these are constantly creating a narrative that we construct. We tell it to ourselves, we tell it to others, and we file it in that history of our own lives, which helps us to define who we are. And then, in very much the same way as Hollywood accentuates the blues and the oranges in every film so that things become more vivid, so we can, with compounds, do a post-production of our own life's narrative. And we want to try and do that in the best possible way. And I guess what we're going to be talking about is how we can do it, how we can work towards doing it in a good way, what are the challenges, hurdles, what are the stepping stones, what we know, what we don't know, and what we know that we have to overcome. So, let's start. Let's put ourselves in context, okay? We live in the universe. The universe is made up of galaxies. Galaxies are made up of stars, each with its own solar system, and we have our solar system called the Sol solar system, and we live on the third rock from the sun in a very narrow portion of the crust that is something we call the biosphere. Okay, so that's the little tiny slice of the universe in which we live in. It doesn't bother us to address the entire universe in all of its entirety, and it's really a tribute to Horton Hears a Who, the way we, living on this tiny, tiny layer of crust of a little rock circling a yellow star, are sitting here and pondering the entire cosmos. But in the very same way as the people of Whoville talked to Horton the elephant from on their speck, we are doing the same, or attempting to do the same, with the cosmos. So life is evolving on planet Earth. And according to Richard Dawkins, you have an original replicator, which makes copies of itself and has to use resources from the environment, building blocks, in order to make copies of itself. And evolution comes into play when some mistakes are made. Now, mistakes, sometimes they break things, but sometimes they make things better. The ones that make things better outcompete those that didn't make the fortuitous mistake. And that is evolution in action. So when you have a self-replicating system and it makes copies and copies of itself, but there are sometimes mistakes are made, and those rare mistakes happen to be a happy mistake, then evolution happened. The thing is that there is no one direction that is the right direction. The goal keeps changing, because if there is any trajectory in evolution, it is the ascension towards complexity. If you want to be able to replicate, harvest energy, make copies of yourself, and replicate more, and you want to do it really easily, those opportunities in biology, they're called evolutionary niches. And all of the really easy niches, they've already been taken. They've been taken. They're gone. We don't have access to them. If you look at evolution, you see organisms getting more and more complex, systems building on other systems. You see the lobster mushroom parasitizing on its host, which is itself catabolizing an autotrophic organism, which is a conglomerate of cells, meaning it's a multicellular organism, it's not a simple thing. It's a very, very complex system. As you go along evolution, you see that being able to survive slowly and gradually becomes more complicated. I have this image in my mind of the giant worms of Gippsland, and to me, I think of a human as carrying around one of these giant worms inside their torso, and we simply call it a digestive system. These worms exist in Gippsland, in the mud, in the clay, without any person carrying them around. So we're talking about the human condition. The human condition is really today characterized by the fact that we have evolved to be walking digestive systems that evolved in order to hunt and gather in the African savanna. And I think that later on we'll touch on the specific dynamics of what that means. But in this context, we need to understand that in our torso, we carry around a digestive system. And we carry it around on legs. We use hands to obtain food, shove it into the beginning of the digestive system, and defecate it out at the end of the digestive system. And the brain is the control room of this vehicle that is moving around a mouth and an anus, the same mouth and anus which exists in the worm that doesn't have all the rest of the appendages. Now, there's a chemical correspondence between the digestive system, which digests the food, and the brain, which controls the body. The digestive system has to say to the brain, hey, I'm hungry. It also has to say to the brain, hey, I'm not hungry anymore. it's time to do something that isn't eat or look for food, like have sex, create shelter, all kinds of things that the digestive system basically just transmits a message to say, I'm okay now, do something else. So there's a chemical correspondence between the digestive system and the brain. That means that the blood-brain barrier is not a wall that doesn't allow anything in. It will allow certain chemicals, certain signals to come from the digestive system. And that is exploited. The blood-brain barrier is a layer of cells that coats all of the blood vessels that go in and out of the brain. So the brain is more selective about what kind of molecules it will accept into it. It doesn't accept all of the molecules that the body does. It is more selective. And that gatekeeper is called the blood-brain barrier. And it coats all of the veins and arteries from the neck and up. Since there are certain exceptions to what the blood-brain barrier allows into the brain, that leniency in policy of chemical discourse has allowed plants and animals, and more than anything, us humans, to exploit the fact that we can find psychoactive compounds in our environment. So the brain says, I'm allowing some molecules in. The brain is basically saying, I allow myself to be manipulated by an external source, in this case, the digestive system, which is an external source. The brain is working in cooperation with, and in conjunction with, and in synchronization with. However, if you find a molecule that can make it through the blood-brain barrier, the brain will allow it in and listen to its signal, even though it doesn't know that it is actually a Trojan horse. It is actually not made by the digestive system. It is not made by the body at all. It's made by an external source, and still it has an effect on the brain. And that is what compounds that we call psychoactive. Thank you for listening to Psychonerds, and this is Dr. Z, and I want to thank Uri Marans for co-producing this show with me.